Thank you so much for coming this afternoon to our next session, Cybersecurity for the Defense of Democracy. We have 3 speakers from the Defending Democracy program today, and before I do their intros, a couple little housekeeping things. Just remember, Q&A is at the end of the session. I know you guys are going to have exciting questions to ask. Don't burst out in the middle of the presentation, please, but save them for the end. We have runners on both sides of the rooms who will bring you a mic. If you're a social media user, please, be considerate. Don't, if you have concerns or hard questions, before you drop them on Twitter, please take advantage of the Q&A time to ask them. Because we're trying our best to be very transparent and honest and open about some of the programs going on at Microsoft today and have that dialogue with you. And so dialogue happens best in person versus with the entire internet. But feel free to tweet as well. And then please turn off or silence your mobile devices. I don't have a cute little video like in the movie theaters, but you get the idea. So, getting started with our next session, we have Jan Nuyts, Bobby O'Brien, and Ginny Bedans. I'm sorry, I should have checked that first. Here to speak with us today. Bobby is a senior cybersecurity strategist and the program management lead for the Cybersecurity and Democracy team. Jan is the director of cybersecurity policy at Microsoft and leads the team. And Ginny is the director of special programs. Special strategic programs. We're just going to add new things to her title. Ginny's kind of awesome. So we're going to let them get started, and thanks so much for your time and attention.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. Well, thank you so much to our friends at MSRC for having us. My name is Jan Nuyts. I lead our Defending Democracy program. And it's our special honor really to have a slot on this agenda and be able to share with all of you some of the things that we're doing as part of this effort, which is a fairly new effort at Microsoft. Let me just kind of, before we get into what specifically we're doing as a team and as part of our program, back up for a second and share obviously some of the context for how we got to where we got. And I would assume that all of this is quite familiar to all of you, but one of the main drivers, obviously, for us to be concerned about cyber-enabled threats to democracy is the fact that nation-state cybersecurity attacks and threats are increasing. And so our team put together just a very basic, high-level timeline on what some of these attacks entail. And I think part of this is to tell the story that obviously these attacks have increased in frequency. They are becoming, to some degree, more sophisticated. And one of the, I think, things that are of most concern is the targets that these actors are going after are no longer some of the more traditional targets and motivations really for financial gain or maybe more traditional military espionage. It has really become a tool in trying to interfere with some of the most core processes and institutions that underpin our democratic societies. That was evidenced not only in the 2016 US elections, which I think we're all familiar with, but frankly, it's been a concern around the world for many democratic countries. When you look at the French elections in 2017, the fact that the German parliament got compromised in the run-up to the German elections, and when you read some of the reporting out there, the Canadian Intelligence Agency recently put out a report that estimated that about 40 countries in the last 10 years or so have had their electoral processes targeted through cyber means by nation-state actors. So this is certainly something that is on the rise, and I think it is of concern to all of us. As I mentioned, we have some prominent examples of this, and in part because of what we're witnessing, it sort of occurred to us, and it seems to us that democracy itself really needs a cybersecurity strategy. And part of this context has then led Microsoft to decide earlier this year that we need to do more. That we can't just rely on the fact that governments or others in industry are going to take steps in this regard. And we're all aware that many governments are very concerned about this and are taking important steps. But we too, from a Microsoft perspective, need to think about what we can do in this context from a much more holistic perspective. Just for some context, there's been a lot of work going on at the company for years, working with political parties, working to some degree with some of the main political committees, both in this country and also in other countries around the world. But what we wanted to do by launching the Defending Democracy program is to bring all of this together in sort of a more robust way. And when we announced the program on April 13 of this year, there were sort of 4 things that we said we were going to do, and sort of 4 core pillars to our program. One is to think about ways and very actively work with the campaign ecosystem to protect campaigns from hacking and help campaigns better protect their infrastructure and the way that they are able to secure themselves. And so campaign security is a huge component of this work. The second piece, of course, relates to processes that are underpinning the elections themselves. So how folks both at the state and local level in this country, sometimes the federal level in other countries, are leveraging technology and securing that technology to run the voting process. And that's everything from voter registration databases to tallying of the vote, securing those pieces, as well as then reporting out the vote. And both Bobby and Ginny in a moment will talk about those 2 aspects in particular. But there's a second part to this, which is really closely connected. And I think we are, in our minds at least, well advised to think about the threats to democracy in a holistic manner. It's not just the underlying infrastructure that we're concerned about. It's also very much on what you could sort of call the content side. And the 2 things that clearly stand out there are disinformation campaigns, computational propaganda that we've seen several nation-state actors employ. There's one particular nation-state that I think we're all most concerned about in that regard. And then there's the issue which is closely related, and that's advertising, political advertising, especially in the online space, and the transparency or lack thereof that we all need to take a hard look at and figure out what we can do from an industry perspective, what some sound policies in that space look like, and so on. And so that is my quick intro for you in terms of what we're doing. We're very much looking forward to broadening out our partnerships as a program. As I said, we're a fairly new effort. And if you want to get engaged with us and our team, please do reach out, both if you're working on these problem sets from a technical perspective. If you're here representing a government organization, we'd love to hear from you and learn from you if there are initiatives going on in this space. And I will, with that, turn it over to Ginny. Thank you. There you go, Ginny.
Thank you. Okay, so campaign security. There are a few things to think about. Jan's already alluded to them when we talk about campaigns and why they need special attention right now, not just in the US but abroad. Of course, we know about what happened in 2016, and as he mentioned, there are a lot of other incidents in other countries as well, where information was all of a sudden weaponized. It wasn't used for traditional espionage like we've seen it previously, but it was used in a new and kind of different way. But before we get into the details of what we're doing now, I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about how Microsoft's been engaged in the campaign space previously. There were teams who have already been working with the political campaigns and committees. We supported the Iowa caucuses in 2016 through technology solutions to help them get the vote right and get the results reported on time. We also supported the national nominating conventions for the 2 parties in the US, and that was really an infrastructure build. We helped with both security as well as just their operations as they led up to the conventions. So this is a space that the company has been paying attention to, has been plugged into and engaged in previously. But when we think about campaigns and the party committees and the folks who are in that ecosystem, and we think about it from a security standpoint, there are a few things that make them a little bit different. Campaigns are traditionally not very well funded, and I'm speaking in the US context right now, and that is somewhat contrary sometimes to what you might hear in the media, where you hear about millions of dollars, especially because the US has such a different system. Sometimes people have this impression that campaigns do have a lot of money. The money is all based on donor contributions from donors, and they are often fighting for resources as to how they want to spend that money. And they are motivated by victory, right? So they're going to spend the money on ways that they can see to getting out the vote. And it's often very difficult to get them to spend those hard-earned funds on basic infrastructure and IT setup. The other thing to think about is campaigns are often like startups, in that they start up really quickly, they've got an influx of some money, and they have to build out really quickly. The difference, though, is that they crash and they're over soon after. So there is no longevity in what they're trying to build. They're built to be temporary. And that is not a great scenario when you want to emphasize security and get them to think about security. They don't hire IT teams. Occasionally they will. Some well-funded campaigns will actually have an outside IT firm that will do work for them. But often the person who's running their IT is also the guy that they depend on to do their digital ad buys. So they're not thinking of this the same way that other companies or traditional larger companies will. But when you combine that with the vulnerability that they experience right now, especially, and the fact that we know that they are under attack, and the fact that we know that there are nation states and others who want to get into their emails, who want to get access to their documents, that's really kind of a recipe for disaster. We already talked about the context, so we'll move on. So many of you probably heard about, in fact, many of you were probably involved in an announcement that the company made earlier this last month, referencing some spoofed sites where Microsoft, again, folks probably in this room, identified that there were sites that were being spoofed for phishing attempts, particularly for the organizations IRI, which is International Republican Institute, and the Hudson Institute, as well as a generic Senate site and also a Microsoft site. And so when these sites were identified, one thing that we did that was a little bit different and stepped out of kind of a traditional path is that Brad Smith authored a blog that not only referenced the specific sites that we found, but also attributed them to Strontium, also known as Fancy Bear, which is one of the connected Russian organizations. So in that announcement, one thing that you may have heard about as well was the release of a new program that our team is running that we're calling Account Guard. So just want to talk a little bit about what Account Guard is and who it's targeted for, because we have identified the need that these campaigns have for some additional protections. One thing that we as a team wanted to identify early was how can we, between now and the midterm elections, how can we come alongside our customers? So these are political campaigns, committees, as well as think tanks, democracy advocacy organizations, and then also some of the vendors who are these little small companies who do work on the tech front lines for these organizations as well. How can we come alongside them and help them protect themselves as they lead up to the election? And so Account Guard is fundamentally about offering three things. First and foremost, it's about education. I guess we can go on to this slide. First and foremost, it's about education. And the reason for that is we did a little bit of sort of a listening tour with some security professionals, many of them probably in this room, where we wanted to understand how we could come and help these customers and these folks. And the first thing we heard was, look, there's no voodoo that the security community can do that's going to be better than these guys turning on multi-factor authentication. There's nothing that we can do to help track or monitor attacks against them if they're not showing that they can have good passwords. And we took that really seriously, because while we are enlisting support of folks like you and across the company, we do also want to make sure that we are talking to these customers about what they can do to protect themselves with the equipment and the features and the tools that are already there. And so with that in mind, we lead with education. So when folks opt into the program and enroll in it, the first thing that we do is send them prescriptive guidance. And we start talking to them about, hey, we know you're using Office 365. Here are some really easy ways that you can protect yourself with the program that already exists. Here are some ways that you can turn on multi-factor authentication, at least for your admins. Okay, now let's roll it out to the rest of your users. And then we also give them guidance on things like best case scenario for how you can teach your employees to use better password security. And we use things that are not just Microsoft focused, but also based on other products that are out there, because we're really trying to educate them about how they can have better security. So education is the first tool in Account Guard. The second is what we're calling cross-account notifications. So what is kind of unique here is there's a process already that if our threat intelligence team is aware that a customer has been attacked or breached by a nation state actor, that we go through a process by which we notify them of that. But what's unique about Account Guard is we're inviting them to include individuals within their organization. So it's employees, maybe if we're talking about a campaign, maybe it's the spouse of the candidate. Any individual who is going to likely be targeted because of their affiliation with the group that is opted into the program, if they have an individual personal Microsoft account, so that's a hotmail.com or an outlook.com account, they can also opt into Account Guard individually. They'll get access to the education components that come with it already, but what they'll also get is they'll be granting us permission that if they are attacked or breached by one of these known nation state actors and we detect it, we can then notify their organization that we see that happening on their individual account. So what this is doing is trying to close an information gap that exists in this election community. So the example here, as we've already referenced, is the John Podesta situation where his personal Gmail account was attacked and hacked because of his affiliation with the Clinton campaign. However, no one really knew that the two were connected because, of course, they were separate accounts. And so with the permission of the individuals, we're now able to notify the organization they're affiliated with if we see that activity. It also provides a better mapping situation for our threat intelligence teams so that they can tell that this random hotmail.com account over here is actually the campaign manager of this really important Senate race. And that provides them with a better mapping of what the threats are. And then the third aspect of the program is that we're providing access to private previews. For folks in this audience, that's not all that interesting or new, but when you think about the pace of a political campaign, you think about where their attention is and their focus is, they are not paying attention to our latest and greatest Office 365 security private preview. They don't know it exists, they don't know how to get to it, they don't really care. So what we're doing is reaching out to them and saying, hey, there's a really cool program that we think will really make your security better, and we sort of walk them through the process of getting them enrolled, or at least, at the very least, making sure that they're aware of it. So that's Account Guard in a nutshell, and then Bobby's going to come talk to you about our work with election integrity.
Great, thank you, Jenny. So I want to talk briefly today about election integrity. I want to start actually in the year 2000, which many of you remember that election, not for security reasons, but because of the issue of hanging Chad and other issues around ballot discrepancy. So what did that do? In effect, what it did is it shone a lot of light on the American election process. It brought to light a lot of significant issues with that process and ultimately stimulated some congressional action in terms of the 2002 Help America Votes Act. In 2016, we had a little bit of a similar scenario. The difference was it wasn't necessarily discrepancy in ballots resulting from hanging Chads, but instead security incidents that brought election integrity into question. So where did that lead us? Really what it led us to an understanding of the fact that the US election process itself is really a system of systems. The questions around election integrity shone a light again on our election processes and showed just how complex they are. So I have a few different visuals here from a report that was recently put out called Securing the Vote from the National Academy of Sciences. Josh Benelo, who may or may not be here but is in Microsoft Research and is a senior cryptographer, was actually a part of that committee. Really what these visuals are designed to do is talk about all the different elements of the election process, or at least some of them, and how complex they are. So on the top left there you can see a mapping at the county level of different voting machines that are in use. And you can see that it's enormously diverse. You have the election process itself, which consists of multiple different elements. And then you have systems that are tied into the election process. Could be the DMV, could be an online VR system as well. All in all, you're talking about 10,000 different election administration jurisdictions. Many of them have the ability to make their own decisions about how an election occurs. From a security perspective, obviously, this makes things extremely challenging. So what are some of the early emerging election security recommendations? The first, and you guys will probably laugh a little bit at these because these are recommendations that kind of come up in any security context. The first is let's put more money into the game. Okay, so there's a legitimate reason for this. After the 2000 election, the Help America Vote Act authorized somewhere between $3 and $4 billion. To date, the only additional funding that's gone out for the purpose of election security since 2016 from the government has been $380 million. So there's quite a difference. The second is information sharing. Again, this is probably one that you guys, security practitioners, hear quite a bit. In this context, we see information sharing both from being proposed both from the perspective of private enterprise, sharing information with government, but more importantly, with the federal government sharing information with the state government and vice versa. The Secure Elections Act, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation, that was or is co-sponsored by, amongst others, the chair and vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, who performed a pretty authoritative investigation into the 2016 election, looked at information sharing as a core piece of the puzzle in terms of solving some of the election security issues. So what does that look like? It looks like, if a state experiences a verified target of its voter registration databases, providing that information to other states, providing that information to the federal government. If the federal government, from an intelligence perspective, is aware of verified threats against U.S. Elections writ large, providing that information to states. And so information sharing has also been one of the early election security recommendations. The final recommendation to note is this idea of audits, and particularly post-election audits. I think this has gained a lot of traction because generally the idea is, well, if we know that some of these systems may be targeted and in fact may be tampered with, we, at the very least, if we can't protect that and we assume some form of breach, we need to be able to determine afterwards that that breach occurred and that the results have been affected. In the audit space, one of the areas in particular that's been discussed is this idea of risk-limiting audits. Risk-limiting audits were developed in the late 2000s. What they do is they provide statistically robust assurance that an election outcome is in line with the votes cast at an accepted level of risk. But today, in my very brief overview of some of the work on election integrity, really what I want to get back to is this idea that we're really at the early days of understanding, especially on the US side, let alone the international side, the end-to-end vulnerabilities in the election process. And in fact, when you hear a lot of the dialogue that's focusing on issues related to election integrity, really what it's focused on is what we know was targeted in 2016. In some cases, more granularly, what we know to be vulnerabilities, whether it relates to voting systems, voter registration databases, so on and so forth. One of the things that we've been toying with as a team is the idea of not only how can you use cybersecurity technology to help defend democracy, but also how can you instill cybersecurity methods into the process of thinking about the defense of democracy. And so one that we've talked about that will be old news to many of you, but is in fact news to many of the stakeholders that we're working with, is the idea of basically threat modeling. Hey, we need to understand, if we look across the elections, we understand there are going to be many different vulnerabilities. Do we actually understand where those vulnerabilities are and what the impact is if they're exploited? Is it the case, for instance, that voter registration databases, which were targeted overwhelmingly in 2016, are actually the most critical vulnerability that we need to go out and protect? Or should that investment be spent someplace else? And so one of the questions that we're really asking, and I have a nice little picture up here that probably looks familiar to many of you of the Microsoft threat modeling tool, is what does the threat model for democracy look like at a broad level? Or more specifically, we could look at elections. What does the threat model look like? How do we think through the exercise from a technical and a political perspective, frankly, in an interdisciplinary way of thinking about if you were an adversary and you wanted to affect an election, whether it's a U.S. presidential election or election in a particular jurisdiction, what would actually be the avenue, the threat vector that you would use to have the most impact? And so with that, I want to pivot to our call to action. We'll start with Jan.
Sure. So first of all, thank you both. I thought that was terrific. Maybe one thing I'd like to do is actually ask. We have members of the team in the room. So could I ask members of the Defending Democracy program to stand up so you get a sense of? Oh, there we go. Excellent. If you want to connect with the team, these are the folks that you should feel free to reach out to, in addition to whom you're seeing on stage. Quick word about the team. It's a diverse a group of highly talented people that I get to work with. We have some technologists as well as public policy experts and some legal expertise. And so we really are sort of a cross-domain team trying to focus on these issues. The reason I mention this is we are recruiting. And so if you're interested in getting in touch with us, please do reach out. But it's not just about this being a great recruitment ground. This really also is about us wanting to, as I said earlier, learn about initiatives that all of you might be engaged in, or programs you're running, where we can explore opportunities for partnership. So,
another call to action is getting involved in the democratic process, and that can mean it's National Voter Registration Week, so I have to make the plug. register to vote if you're not already registered to vote. Democracy starts with you. But other than that, other ways that you can get involved outside of the traditional volunteering and knocking doors, you all have a very special set of skills. And so those are really desperately needed in this space right now. There are a lot of nonprofit groups, fairly small for the most part, but there are some nonprofit groups out there that are looking for people with security expertise who can volunteer their time, contributing to campaigns or committees or others in this space who really need some help. We're happy to connect you with them. They tend to be partisan, but there are ones on both sides. So if you have a particular interest, please, it really goes back to the first point, please feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to connect you with some of the organizations that will connect you and let you sort of bring your expertise and help these campaigns, because they certainly could use some of your support.
And the last thing was just a discussion point. I would encourage everybody to think creatively about ways cybersecurity technology and methods can actually be put to work in defending democratic institutions. Threat modeling is just one example amongst many. In addition, as you're going through your own security exercises, whether it's a final security review or other security reviews along the way to releasing a product or a feature or a service, think about the potential impact that that service could have on some of these democratic institutions. I think it'll be a fun exercise, and if you have any good learnings, please share them with us.
And with that, we are happy to take your questions, if there are any.
Hello. I've spoken with someone on the Senate IT team who bemoans the separation between the hard separation between personal mail, campaign mail, and government mail,
Yeah.
where it just it's completely unmanageable for them.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight or guidance that you're working on at the federal level to try and deconflict some of this or change policies?
So when I talked about Account Guard, I didn't mention that we are looking at how we can expand it. We've had a lot of requests from different industries and markets where we can expand it. One of the areas that we'd really, really like to go to, that we're just working at the legal aspect of it, is to Congress and Senate. Their official offices, if they're using Office 365 but they have Microsoft personal accounts, essentially what Account Guard is doing is trying to bridge that very gap. Obviously, it's really newsy with what happened last week and the reports that Senate staff were being targeted on their personal accounts. We can't, of course, have much control over their personal accounts if they're not related to Microsoft products, though we do talk to our colleagues at other companies, and I know everyone's really thinking about this right now. But the way that we as Microsoft can impact that is trying to bring Account Guard to other groups like that and try and bridge the gap between those accounts.
The other issue there that we run up against, again, this is a real world issue that many of you probably deal in many areas, but we run into, for instance, in the Account Guard scenario or other scenarios regarding security, things like campaign finance restrictions, and Ginny can speak a little bit to what we did in that space. But there are blockers from an administrative and a legal perspective, oftentimes, to actually getting security best practices into space, and that's part of our remit as a team, is to figure out how we can, overcome some of those hurdles.
Yeah, it was our goal to do it from the beginning, but there's legal concerns. But to his point, one thing that we did, we are offering this to political campaigns right now. Well, there are laws about offering things for free to political campaigns. Essentially, you can't do it. And Account Guard is not something that we're upcharging for. It's considered an additive feature for our existing customers who are eligible. So what we did was we wrote a letter to the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, requesting not a waiver so much as saying we think that this is our choice to add this feature to our customers who are already paying. We think it fits well within federal election laws. Do you agree? And they held a hearing. The FEC, this is something you won't hear very often, was really wonderful. And they voted on they held the hearing as quickly as was possible given their constraints and rules. So it was within 10 days of us submitting the letter. And they voted unanimously across partisan lines to approve it, which I don't know the last time they did that on any matter. They're pretty much deadlocked on everything these days. So it's a good indication that they think that this is important, and also that we were making a good legal case. We hope to make that same case for the federal government customers as well as for particular state customers. We also hope to make that case as we expand it to other democracies, because this isn't something that we want to limit to US customers. We'd really like to spread it to others as well. But as you can imagine, every country has its own rules, its own laws, GDPR, there are a lot of things to consider. And so we're working on expanding it as best we can elsewhere.
Yeah, maybe I'll just pick up on that last point. So really important, we are trying to actually take elements of this program, both in terms of what we're doing with Account Guard, but also more broadly to other countries around the world. There's a lot of, as you all know, there are many, many elections happening all the time. There are some really, from a geopolitical perspective, interesting countries coming up that are holding elections, in particular Central Eastern Europe, but also we're seeing Latin America. And so we've had a lot of interest, both internally in the company, but also externally from partners and from governments, frankly, to figure out ways for how we can partner with them on some of these questions. So I think that's just maybe to highlight sort of the global nature of the program. And I think the other piece really around the question of Account Guard, what you were saying, we're grateful, obviously, that the FEC moved fast on this. Those rules clearly differ country by country, and so there are some places where we're able to move a little faster than others. But we're quite enthusiastic, really, about the opportunity to work with these stakeholders in advance of the midterm elections, because clearly they're coming up very fast, and we were thinking about ways that we could actually offer something impactful in a very short order of time. Last piece on this is the other thing that we've really noticed, and feedback we've been getting is obviously great for us as one company to try and help and provide some of these solutions, but we also see a need for a lot more sort of cross-industry collaboration. And I think it's fair to acknowledge that some of the other major players in the space have started to offer similar services. I'd obviously think Account Guard is very special, but on sort of a serious and first, but a serious point is just from sort of a threat perspective, it makes a lot of sense from our perspective to coordinate some of these things in a more robust way when it comes to, for example, threat intel sharing. And so we're thinking about ways very actively, and we're in conversations with our partners about how we can accomplish that. So just wanted to add that. Any other questions?
Hi. So I've noticed some places around our country are starting to dabble in electronic voting. Do you have an opinion on that?
Do you want to collect a couple of questions, or do you want to go one?
I'm trying to avoid that.
That's a great question.
There's one state, West Virginia, who recently announced that they are doing blockchain voting online through an app, and they're doing it for military professionals who are living abroad. So I'll start by saying that we commend West Virginia for trying to think about how they can solve this very big problem of how they make sure that their citizens and members of their state who are abroad, especially those serving the country abroad, are able to cast their vote and do it in a way that's timely and will be counted. So we recognize that. As far as the principle of voting in that method, we think that there are probably some better ways that it can be done. I think that the general consensus right now is moving away from anything electronic for the mechanism of actually voting. So even in the polling places, the direction everything is going is really towards paper ballots. But it's worth remembering that while that is a problem that needs to be solved and addressed, it is an end-to-end issue that we're talking about. You're not going to get voter registration back on paper, right? That will take everyone back many steps. We need to be able to have solutions where people are able to register to vote. We need accessible solutions for folks to actually cast their ballot, and sometimes paper is not the most accessible way. So there's going to be an electronic component in voting somewhere in the process, and we as a community, as well as others who are thinking about this really hard, need to find a way to make that as most secure as possible.
And just to double click on that really briefly, I flashed the National Academy of Sciences report up there. I mentioned the Secure Elections Act. Again and again, you see recommendations coming out from the election security community that say there at least needs to be an auditable paper trail. That paper trail in particular is actually a requirement for risk limiting audits, which is considered sort of state of the art. And so regardless of what we feel individually on this matter, you can see that the consensus as a whole is really moving in that direction.
Hi, great. Yes, so with a lot of the work that NIST has been doing over the past decade with the cybersecurity framework that has helped private enterprises, and then most recently the work that they've been doing for small to medium businesses, producing a simplified version of that, it seems like all the work that Microsoft is committing today along with some parallel work being done by Google and other tech companies, it seems like we're in a position where we might even begin discussing with, engaging with NIST to produce another set of standards for elections. Do you know, from your vantage point, have those engagements begun, or what's the state of discussion in that area?
Yeah, it's an absolutely fantastic point. And in fact, one of the things that we didn't mention is that U.S. elections were actually classified as critical infrastructure following 2016, which actually technically brings it within scope of the cybersecurity framework. To date, the cybersecurity framework obviously wasn't focused on elections. It's cybersecurity framework for critical infrastructure now, so I know that there's work underway in that domain that we're attempting to plug into. There's questions about exactly how it will fit into the framework, what that will look like. In addition, and again, this is one where Josh Benelow is very involved, there's the voluntary voter standards guidelines, the VVSG, and other sort of standards work that's been done across the federal level that's engaged NIST quite closely in terms of figuring out, in that case, it's not just security, it's across the voting process writ large. But I think the long and short of it is, you're absolutely right. I think that NIST is a place that has a lot of expertise in this space that could be ported over to look at this issue area, and we're actively looking at engaging them on that.
Why don't we start in the back? Maybe,
Who wants to call
work
it, or
our way
we-
forward.
Sure. You have the mic.
Good afternoon. I wanted to ask to one of the points that you made earlier about how within industry we have a lot of companies wanting to work together on this kind of topic. I'm actually very curious in terms of U.S. government, for example, is there a lot of interagencies wanting to work together for these things? Because kind of looking at government, it feels like there's a bit of a hands-off, like we're going to handle it our way, we're going to handle it our way. So I'm very curious, is there that actual collaboration between various government agencies for this type of topic?
Well, I'll start by saying that the government agencies have, specifically DHS, has two task forces that are really focused on this. One is the Foreign Influence Task Force. Theirs is a little bit more in the disinformation social media side. Then they also have an election security task force that's headed up by a gentleman named Matt Masterson, who actually was running the EAC. I know this is getting really wonky, but like the EAC was the Election Assistance Commission. Point is, he's really knowledgeable, really understands the challenges that are facing the states as far as what they're trying to do from a security standpoint. I know that they are reaching out to all of the tech companies. I know your question is more about interagency, but sort of starting by saying how they're reaching out to us and to our community. They're doing a very good job of trying to create a dialogue. Going back to your slide about information sharing in an informal way, there are already some formal mechanisms, of course, for sharing information. I know that they work with FBI closely, who has parallel task forces that they've set up for similar purposes. I'm not like in their business, so I don't know how they're all talking to each other, but I do know that these task forces are set up for the very purpose of creating dialogue, not just with one another, but also with us and others who are invested in this space, like NGOs and nonprofits who are doing a lot of work with elections. Yeah, I don't know if you have any.
The other thing I'd add on that is, again, this is an interagency, but it's the federal state level dynamic. So, by classifying elections as critical infrastructure, that actually empowered DHS to put forth tremendous resources to provide to states. States ultimately, in election jurisdictions are able to make their own decisions, but it opened up a floodgate of new resources. If you go up on the DHS website and you look at things like the Election Security Task Force, they're offering vulnerability scanning services, they're offering risk management training. They are setting up, Matt Masterson amongst others, are regularly setting up calls to coordinate. There's an ISAC. And other ways that really the federal government is working directly with the election administrators and the secretaries of state who oftentimes oversee elections to make sure that they're able to maximize their security posture.
I think they have Albert sensors in like almost every state now. The states are letting them in to put in Albert sensors. So there's, that's a great point, is the federal-state communication is better than you might have expected it to be. I've been impressed with the work that they've been able to do together.
Quick question. So a lot of customers who aren't political campaigns deep in South Central kind of like energy companies are kind of wondering how can they benefit from this? Are the items that you guys are doing, or is it kind of trickling down to our regular customers, or is there something they can do to engage with you guys and say like, hey, we're not a political campaign, but we are critical infrastructure energy company or anything like that? Or just generally, we just want to be as safe as possible? What can other customers do to help themselves in that situation?
Sure. I can,
Yeah, go ahead.
Did I turn this up?
You on? Yeah.
You're good.
Still hear me? Okay.
You're good.
This is okay. I just say, our program is part of a broader effort at the company that is looking both into cybersecurity policy from sort of a perspective of best practices recommendations, things like helping to actually explain the NIST cybersecurity framework, which we certainly contributed to, as well as, and this is a little bit more specific to the efforts that you're seeing here, also connecting to different security teams across the company. And so that's both on the proactive side when it comes to security assessments, but also on the reactive side. And so one of the things we've been doing for this team is actually pull together what we sort of call a broader virtual team across the company that ties in these different pieces. Of course, there are many established processes that Microsoft has, not only MSRC, we got the CDOC, the Cyber Defense Operations Center, and so on, that sort of are part of our broader security posture. But we try certainly whenever we come across things that we think are applicable for other stakeholders, customers, to make sure that some of the, not only the work that we're doing, but some of the lessons learned, and ultimately some of the sort of services that we're standing up are going to be made available to broader audiences. So one example is Account Guard, right? We're already seeing that we saw so much interest from sort of the broader policy community and sort of democratic institutions that we decided to, at launch, go beyond just political campaigns, but also focus on think tanks, research institutions, et cetera. We're actively thinking, as Ginny said, about broadening that out further. And as we're developing, for example, best practice and guidance, be it here the top 10 ways you can secure your O365 account or your Azure instance, many of those will be applicable not just to campaigns, but to many others, for example, small and medium enterprises. And so we're working hand in glove with those other teams that are focused on those stakeholders. Mm-hmm. Here.
Thank you. So with regards to the disinformation portion of the initiative, could you speak a little bit about how Microsoft can contribute to this in a way that's nonpartisan and also respectful of freedom of speech?
Yeah. You want to talk about NewsGuard?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So one of the things that we've really been working on from a disinformation perspective, because obviously our services are quite different from those who oftentimes have platforms where disinformation manifests on the platform itself, is actually working predominantly on research partnerships. And so some examples of research partnerships are the Oxford Internet Institute in the UK, who's created an International Election Observatory, which is effectively taking sort of their tried and tested methodology for measuring the effect of particularly computational propaganda, but also some other misinformation efforts, and applying it to specific election scenarios. So they recently put out a report on Sweden. They're working on Brazil, obviously the US election. We're also partnering with Princeton University, who's developing what they think are disinformation detection tools. I would also say that there's a lot more work occurring organically at the company in this space than I had expected when we originally came into it, which is to say a lot of very smart technologists and security professionals, some cases working on this in a hackathon context, in some cases within Microsoft Research, working on this from a technology research perspective, an economics research perspective. And so really the way that we've been focusing on this is predominantly through creating new partnerships and trying to energize the ecosystem who's focused on this issue area.
You want to say a word about NewsGuard?
Sure, I can talk about that as well. So another a prominent partnership that we announced was a partnership with an organization called NewsGuard. NewsGuard Technologies was founded by Stephen Brill and Gordon Krovitz. One of them was traditionally associated with the left side of the political spectrum, one on the right side. They're longtime experienced journalists who hired a number of different analysts, typically individuals who also have backgrounds in journalism, to effectively go look at online news media. In particular, I think it's like the top 98% of shared online news media in the English language in the United States. And from a journalistic perspective, create a series of 9 transparent criteria, go to the source level, which is like the site itself, the digital news media outlet, not at the article level, and determine from their perspective how that site lines up against those criteria. They then manifest that in what they call a nutrition label, which is something that's always very easy for all of us to digest. In technical terms, they have launched a Edge extension as well as a Chrome extension that you can actually install with one click. When you do install it, if you go to Bing or to Google or even some of the social media platforms, you'll see that next to an article, if it's associated with a news site that they have rated, you'll see either a green or red shield, or if it's the Onion, it's actually a jester in purple. And if you hover over that, it'll tell you something to the effect of either, from our perspective, this site has been complying with the basic practices of journalistic integrity, or proceed with caution, but still proceed. It also has more information from a nutrition label perspective that you can click on and get lots of extra data in terms of their perspective on that site. Microsoft helped, we're actually the exclusive sponsor of the launch of the browser plugin, which came out on August 23rd and is available to consumers to download for free. Really the way they position themselves, to your good point about free speech, is providing additional context like a library would on the background of the digital news information that's being consumed, as opposed to telling you whether or not to actually read it.
Yeah, it's really important to understand their approach is not in any way about censorship, right? Which tracks very well with our own approach to this. This is about providing additional transparency and provenance about the news source. And so we think it's a terrific effort. They have an ongoing partnerships with libraries around the country where they're trying to roll this out.
Los Angeles Public Library, Hawaii, many other public libraries as well.
Yeah, and I think they're working on rolling this out also via an API that different platforms can then pull in. So we're
Sorry.
bless you.
My mic's
Very excited about the NewsGuard partnership, I can tell.
You're right there.
What are the biggest challenges you've faced onboarding users and campaigns to defensive software like Account Guard?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's getting their attention, and I mean, honestly, it's getting their, what are we, 40 days out or something from the midterms right now? And so getting a campaign to have the person who's in charge of their IT, if they can find that person, to go online and request an invitation, or if we've invited them, to get them to respond to it. It's a lot about sharing the information. So we've tackled that in a couple ways. First, we reach out to them directly as best as we can identify our customers in that space. We also have been working with the national party committees. I'll say that every eligible national party committee has enrolled in Account Guard, and they
You
are.
should mention a few names so people get a sense of.
Okay.
Oh,
We're
wait,
not supposed-
that's right.
we're not
I'm sorry.
supposed to say.
No, you shouldn't mention a few names.
It's anonymous, but
That's
you can
right.
kind of
on
fill in the
both
gaps.
sides of the aisle, just to be clear. Yeah, don't mention names.
It's a bipartisan grouping, we'll just say that. But they've been working with us as well to get the news out to their campaigns. I will say that it took a little while because we had to get that FEC opinion before they would really buy into it. Understandably, they didn't want to put themselves in a position where they join a program and then later it turns out it's illegal, which was what we were thinking when we went through the process. So we were really glad that it worked out. But yeah, the campaigns, the committees have been helping encourage the campaigns to find us and to enroll. And that's been really beneficial. In fact, one of our colleagues, Dave, is going to be doing a webinar with one of the committees just next week, where they're going to have all of their campaigns join, and he's going to talk to them about Account Guard and sort of espouse the virtues of it and why they should enroll. So the biggest challenge has been awareness and attention. Like even if they're aware of it, just getting them to actually engage.
I think we probably have time for one more.
I was going to say
maybe
one
two.
more question.
Okay.
Do you have someone? Y'all tell me.
I think
Okay.
up there.
Up there.
Between nation-state level actors and financial constraints and lack of awareness, it seems like compromises of especially of campaigns is a question not of if but when.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, is there any thinking around risk mitigation of somebody is going to get in, can we make sure that a candidate's entire email history doesn't get dumped to WikiLeaks?
Well, one thing that we talk about when we talk about education is essentially that, like, have a plan. Of course, no one wants to get hacked, but if you get breached, do you know which federal officials to call? Do you know your local FBI person who you're supposed to reach out to? Do you know, do you have a comms plan? That's something that, for example, the Harvard group at the Belfer Center in Harvard have been doing a lot of work on reaching out to this whole community. There's a whole lot of stuff that they're doing. It's really great. You should check out their site. But one thing that they're doing now is a comms plan to make sure that they know how they're going to respond to the media in case this happens, and that they've thought about it beforehand. So there's certainly conversations happening. We're part of it. Others are as well, to think about what happens if and when that breach occurs. Another thing we didn't really talk about on Account Guard, I need to add it to my talking points. I don't know how I missed it. If that happens, if we go together with our colleagues and do a notification of a breach to one of these customers, we are going to immediately follow up with remediation recommendations. Now, because of a lot of federal laws and whatnot, we can't actually go in and do remediation, but we can offer them some potential next steps. We can make recommendations for vendors given their particular situation or what we are aware has happened. So we are thinking about the worst case scenario, though certainly we're leading with the, hey, try not to let that happen. But if it does, here's some things that you should have planned ahead of time. So that's a great point, because it's going to happen.
All right. Thank you all so much. Let's give them a hand.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right.